Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast in which we discuss imaginary things. We are going to discuss a series which both Tony and I have found most enlightening and enrapturing.
Indeed.
And we are, of course, talking about Jeff VanderMeer's The Southern Reach Trilogy, which starts with the book Annihilation. And I think that is a great place to start, Tony, because Annihilation is exactly what life feels like right now. So let's talk about that. First of all, what is this series? What is it trying to do? And how is Annihilation our entry point into that series?
Yeah, so we have 3 books in this series. Annihilation is the first, followed by Authority and Acceptance. So all 3 of the books are centered around this unknown or unknowable place called Area X. And I say unknown or unknowable because we're going to dig into what we might mean by those, or what I might mean by those.
What can be known about the unknowable.
Yes, right. A little later in the podcast. But this place is called Area X. And we follow, beginning in Annihilation, a group of folks, an expedition sent to Area X. They're the 12th expedition. They know that they know this about themselves heading in there. It's 4 women, a biologist, an anthropologist, a psychologist, and a surveyor, who should really be a geographer, but whatever. We know them only by their titles, by those roles that they occupy. They know going in that every other expedition has either disappeared, or if they've returned, they've died mysterious deaths all from the same cause, or they've gone crazy, committed suicide, something terrible has happened to all the other expeditions. But they go in anyway, and Annihilation is really split between the biologist's point of view as these 4 women are exploring Area X, and some of her life prior to exploring Area X. And then Authority and Acceptance follow up with more building around the world. We see more characters, we see plots go forward, we flesh things out a little bit more. But I think we're going to spend a lot of this podcast talking about Annihilation, because for me at least, it is the strongest book of the trilogy, and there's the most meat there, I think, to actually dig into, in terms not only of what's going on with the plot and the characters, but also the rating, which is just so fabulous.
Which is ironic, I must say, because out of those 3 books, Annihilation is by far the shortest.
Mm-hmm.
They are each, in their own way, unique books. Annihilation is an exploration narrative. Uncanny and weird and terrible as it is an exploration narrative, a discovery story, a travelogue in a sense. Whereas Authority is... It's got strong elements of noir and investigation in it. So think the Maltese Falcon meets science fiction and weird fiction. And then you have Acceptance, which is strange in its own special way and not quite noir, not quite straight science fiction, not anything like Annihilation. Each book has a very different flavor, different central characters, and I find that pleasurable in that we do get to peel away some of the layers as the series goes on. But you're right that Annihilation really gives us what's most important about the world, distilled down to its perfect, simplest essence. So, starting with Annihilation, okay, let's circle back to the title, because I really want to talk about the title. What's symbolic about this title? What does Annihilation as a title tell us about this book? And what does that tell us about the series and the world it's exploring as a whole?
Well, it told me in the first place that this was a book I wanted to read. I can tell you honestly, I picked up Annihilation for the first time. I actually picked up the audiobook because I had about a 5-hour drive, and it seemed like just about the right amount of time, given how long the book is. And I chose it almost entirely based on the title. I looked at the quick blurb, but it was just such an arresting word. I was like, how in the hell can this actually, what does this mean? And that was, what you just said, that was exactly my question. So it's such an unusual word to see on its own without any context whatsoever, not the annihilation of something, or something's annihilation, or, any other formulation you might have, but rather the word by itself without any context whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
It was just so pleasing in a way that I'm having trouble articulating now. I just found it so different from other things that I picked up.
Mm-hmm.
And Annihilation in particular, when, I think Annihilation, and I think this book is going to be like, some jumping on the bandwagon of like post-apocalyptic dystopia and like everything's gray and burned and the world is destroyed and everything. And the blurb said that was not at all the case. Like, this takes place in an almost Edenic setting, and it's weird and it's strange, and you're, the close first person behind one character, and there are very few characters in this setting, and it's just bizarre. And I was like, what is this? What is it? How in the hell does the word annihilation pertain to this blurb? I have no idea. I want to know. I was hooked.
And what was your conclusion?
And
what does annihilation have to do with it?
Well, there's the obvious connection, which is the use of the word annihilation in the book. The characters are psychically conditioned when they hear the word annihilation to commit suicide, which they learn when it doesn't happen correctly. But of course, I think it's much more multi-layered than that. Like, this was not just a single use of the word, but rather this whole idea of layers upon layers upon layers of knowing oneself, knowing others, knowing the other people around you, knowing the other versus knowing the self. That Annihilation, once you see the word in the book, really drives home that connection, that this book is all about that sort of this book is all about keeping you as a reader off balance, in the same way that the characters are very much off balance for the entire book.
Yeah, they're weird characters in a weird setting. And there's nothing that feels secure or knowable about anyone. And I think that honestly is one of the genius elements of this series, that VanderMeer has a very clear sense that other people are never truly knowable, at least not their minds or their souls. And so the entire length of Annihilation, you have these characters, some of them struggling to understand each other, others struggling defiantly to be ununderstandable. And as the series progresses, you introduce new characters who are trying desperately to figure out what the heck happened on this expedition. And and they keep coming up against this wall, which is not strictly geographic, and is not strictly biological, and is not strictly psychological. It's all of those things combined. And I think that the confusion between biological, geographical, and psychological is one of the most appealing things that could have ever happened in science fiction and my life in general. And I have to say, unlike you, I was not drawn to these books the moment I saw them, because the covers are very flowery. And they remind me very much of a certain brand of literary fiction, which usually takes place in lots of drawing rooms with tea kettles and tea cozies. And, there's a certain graphic design element to the covers, which, again, is at odds with the content. And now that I know what's inside these books, it's genius. But like, there's a lot of people who are not going to pick this up because it doesn't look like science fiction, and it doesn't even look like weird fiction. It just looks like romance or something. And the only note that doesn't strike you as romance is the title, Annihilation. And as you mentioned, it conjures up this post-apocalyptic thing. I thought of Oblivion, the movie starring Tom Cruise, when I saw the title Annihilation. So I had these two things warring in me against reading the book. Associations with a, frankly, not wonderful Tom Cruise science fiction movie, and this notion that it wasn't real sci-fi. And I don't know how you feel about that. Let's talk a little bit about how VanderMeer doesn't fit into the science fiction canon.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the single word title thing, I'm just like looking at my shelves now and seeing how many books actually are single titles. Ian M. Banks in the Culture series Accession, Samuel Delaney, Nova, Octavia Butler, Kindred and Fledgling, Nicola Griffith, Ammonite. It's not a small number, and I think that all of those words are appealing and arresting on their own. And I really honestly don't know what it is about the word annihilation that caught me in such a way and really made me pause, because I appreciate what you're saying about the graphic design of those books. I didn't see the print copies first. When I did buy a print copy, I got all three in one volume. So I've seen what you're talking about, but what mine looks like, the cover is just the letter X, one of the crosses, or one of the legs, I don't know, what do you call the different parts of X? One of the lines is like a giant orange line. The other is made up of curling ferns.
What?
And that's it. There's nothing else on the title, on the cover page.
So is this an omnibus? Is that what you would call it?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay. That is slightly more science fictional than the covers that I've seen. The covers that I've seen are, one has a rabbit and one has an owl, I think, and I'm not entirely sure what the third one has on the cover, but they're essentially botanical images that are partially erasing and partially erased by the title itself. And the X... The X omnibus, just for those of you guys who can't visualize this, it's also got a sort of botanical feel to it, but the binding itself looks much more science fiction-y than the others. So, okay, moving on. Yeah. Now that we've hashed out our...
Yeah, so to answer your question, Area X, or at least Annihilation for me, falls into this weird sort of space between fiction and science fiction, because it's fiction about scientists doing science things, but it's not necessarily following a whole lot of the tropes or what you might expect from science fiction. And it's doing a lot else that would mean I wouldn't categorize it as either literary fiction or science fiction. We can talk about some of those things, but I think that it's important to recognize that, for me at least, there's a difference between science fiction and fiction about science, or fiction about scientists. So I don't think all fiction about scientists is necessarily science fiction, even though it is literally science fiction. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
I do.
Okay, cool. So other things that I think this is doing, I mean, I think you could just as easily lump this in with fantasy. Not because it's doing a whole lot that is following fantasy tropes either, or a particularly fantastical structure, but because so much of it is bizarre and out there and, doesn't really fit into science fiction other than being about scientists doing science things. But again, it's not really that. So we're referring to it throughout the podcast, and it has in fact been referred to, as I'm looking at different, looking at Wikipedia, looking around the internet, it's been called horror as well. It falls into the niche of weird fiction, which I know is something that you wanted to talk about, because it's something that we have not talked about on the podcast before, and it's something that I don't want to speak for you, but at least for me, like, it's not something I'm super familiar with, and yet I really loved Annihilation.
Yeah, no, I think weird fiction is probably something that a lot of us readers and you and me both have stumbled across, but not really known quite what to call. And that's because it's straight up weird stuff. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit because Jeff VanderMeer and his wife Anne are pretty active in the science fiction and weird fiction critiquing communities, or whatever you want to call it. They're out there in the world writing articles about weird fiction. They're creating anthologies of weird fiction, as well as, I think they just released the big book of science fiction for the year. So they're out there actively collecting other authors who are in some way, shape, or form communicating with this notion of weird fiction. They cite Leonora Carrington and Haruki Murakami, among others, as influences. We've talked about China Miéville before, and how there are, I guess, spiritual similarities. I can't speak to those directly because I haven't personally read a China Miéville text. I've only read articles by him. So I would really hesitate to say that I'm an expert on those connections. But there's something to be said for the fact that Jeff VanderMeer and Anne VanderMeer exist in this larger community of authors calling themselves weird fiction authors. And I think that their motivation is double. They honestly do see a continuation of legacy and influence between, like, they see a passing of the torch between Haruki Murakami and China Miéville and them, which is, that's one thing, and that's great. But I also think all of these authors are drawn to this moniker, weird fiction, because it's freeing, because science fiction has come to mean a whole bunch of different things that, if you look at them sideways, can be really limiting.
Yes.
And you were talking earlier extensively about how we should or should not define science fiction, especially in relation to these texts. And I think that that's what they're trying to get away from.
Yes.
And so they gave themselves this new name, and it's broad enough that a lot of people can fall into it, but it's also vague enough that none of the specifics are nailed down.
Yes.
And at some point, we're probably going to see people really structure and analyze and deconstruct and reconstruct what weird fiction is. But right now, it seems to be these texts that, in the words of VanderMeer himself, channel the bizarre. And so elements of horror intrude, elements of science and science fiction intrude, but the heart of it is the bizarre, the eerie, the unknowable, the weird.
Yes.
And so I wanted to raise that moniker that they're giving themselves, because I think it's telling about how we receive the text, or how they were intending for us to receive these texts. And VanderMeer, I think, is deliberately hostile to his readers in a way that is artful.
Yes.
He doesn't want his text to be easy to penetrate or understand. And Annihilation is perhaps the perfect example of an impenetrable text. I can't even talk about it. It's so hard to describe how it works, but there are places in authority and acceptance where at least you think you know where you stand in relation to all of the characters, and some of the mysteries are dispelled. And so that's not quite as impenetrable as Annihilation. And we're not saying that Annihilation is a text that you feel lost reading.
No.
You don't. But it's definitely a text that is challenging you, the reader, to reframe how you place perception in the context of reality and identity and meaning in life. So yeah, I guess that's my entire rant about weird fiction. And with the proviso that you should go and read some more of it. It's out there. There's quite a lot. Murakami was one of the canon texts when we were both in graduate school, so I've been exposed to a fair bit of Murakami. And I guess I can see why they would want to belong to each other. I think.
Yeah. It is interesting for me to note that every time I've been in a bookstore and I've looked up Jeff VanderMeer, I've always found copies of the Southern Reach trilogy, either this omnibus or, one or a couple or all three of the books separately. And they're always, without fail, in the fiction section. They're never in the genre section. If a bookstore is separated into fantasy and science fiction, not in either of those. If it's fantasy, science fiction, and horror all lumped together, not in that section. Always in fiction, which is interesting because, I appreciate that he's really, it feels like a really intentional move on his part, on the part of his publishers, on the part of his editors, on the part of everyone who is involved in the creation and the marketing of this book, to say, this is an awesome book, but it's breaking boundaries. And we're pushing back. Right. Yeah, it's actually making a new conversation about what's possible in, air quotes, genre writing versus mainstream fiction versus literary fiction. And we've talked about these things before, and I've sort of railed against these labels, these unnecessary labels, as, byproducts of the publishing market. And I get that, of course. But this is kind of a perfect example of this book is doing so many weird and wonderful things, stretching so many boundaries, and yet it's doing it successfully in so many different areas as well. My neighborhood bookstores all put it in fiction, and yet it has won some of the most prestigious awards for genre books, science fiction and fantasy. And, how do we think about all of that? And by no means is it the only book that has done that. But, I think it's important to recognize the importance of those accolades in reference to where it's categorized.
I think we could even tie this back to our recent podcast about N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season.
Yes.
Because we talked about N.K. Jemisin as transgressive and blurring the line between science fiction and science fantasy and magic and all of these different things. And while that's definitely still true and that's wonderful and that's a completely other wonderful world to explore, this is even weirder. This is even more transgressive. There are literally no boundaries in terms of genre that VanderMeer isn't willing to cross. He lays out this world as if it is the only world, the only... I don't even know how to describe it. Because of the limited... Is it limited first person? The limited first person perspective, you're so close behind the one character, and I'm not going to spoil too much of this, but you're so close behind her, you're pretty much peeking over her shoulder. It's so limited that is the only world that you're given. There is no other world apart from her perception of what's going on. And that proves useful because you're not confronting these world building challenges of making sure systems of magic or systems of science are all in order and agreeing with each other. It's just what happens to her that you have to make sense of. And at certain points, she just simply says, I don't need to make sense of this. I'm just going to go and do this thing. And then you're faced with a character who you also are intrigued by and want to understand and who resists being understood, even though her perception is all that you get. It's such an interesting conundrum. It really is.
Yeah. So I want to take what you just said and ask you a question.
Okay.
So one of the things that we really want to talk about with respect to this series, but especially with respect to Annihilation, is the idea of the alien. And I'm not talking solely about extraterrestrials here. I'm talking about the alien as either unknown or unknowable. And I swear we're getting to that. But before we get to that point, you brought up something really interesting before we started the podcast, which is that these books, or again, at least Annihilation, is drawing on a strong fairy tale affect.
Sure.
I wonder, would you say a little bit more about that? Because comparing this to a fairy tale is a really intriguing comparison, and I don't think it's one I would have made on my own.
Well, okay, so this ties back specifically to a graduate school class that I took with a legendary fairy tale expert, Kate Bernheimer. And she works as a professor for the University of Arizona in the graduate program. And she taught a class on fairy tales. And of course, any graduate student in creative nonfiction is automatically drawn to fairy tales.
Of course.
But I was intrigued by the notion that fairy tales weren't just text, that there was something more going on there that could be uncovered and exploited as a writer. Because I'm interested in atmosphere. And so I took this class, and we spent a lot of time diving into texts that you wouldn't automatically think of as fairy tales, in that they're not folk stories, they're not set in a black forest, you don't have Red Riding Hood cropping up everywhere, except when you do. But what we got down to is this fundamental bedrock of fairy tales is not their shared DNA in like content. So the plot is irrelevant, essentially, to fairy tales. It's the way that they work on you, the reader, or the listener, because a lot of them were, visual or audio or delivered, performed text. It's how it works on you to create this sense of disjointure with the world, and it forces you to reframe your fundamental assumptions about reality and your relationship to it. So when we say fairy tale affect, we're coming from Kate Bernheimer's class, in which affect is spelled with an A, and is tied to the atmosphere and the aesthetic and the operating principles of a fairy tale, but is not about plot, and it's not even about what characters crop up. It's about what it does to you. And so when I'm reading the Annihilation portion of the Southern Reach trilogy specifically, I am being worked on. There was no point when I was reading Annihilation where I did not feel moved in some way, shape, or form, actually manipulated by the text to reframe my fundamental understanding of what's real and what's not, and what identity is, and what meaning is, and who am I, and what's going on, and where am I, and it pushes you outside of comfortable readings of a text. You also were exposed to some of this fairy tale affect conversation.
Yeah.
Do you think I'm on the right track, or am I just making this up because I like fairy tales?
Well, I honestly never... I got into the affect concept, but I never really got behind the fairy tale affect. I was trying to describe the affect of different things. But I believe when we did that study, we were looking at... God, what the hell were we looking at? The alien or exploration or something?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, and that was our affect. So, having not read a lot of fairy tales or been exposed to books that are not fairy tales but have that particular affect, I don't know. I want to say yes, but I don't want to say yes just to agree. but I can see where you're coming from. What, like, if you had to, all right, if you had to pick out, like, 3 or 4 really central elements that contribute to the fairy tale affect in terms of atmosphere or, you know, aesthetic or what have you, what would you say really makes you think that here?
Alienation from self.
Mm-hmm.
Alienation from others.
Mm-hmm.
And the feeling of being set adrift emotionally or physically. Actually, I should reframe that as being set adrift with physical adriftness standing in for or perpetuating emotional and intellectual adriftness, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so the text which created this feeling in me, probably the strongest of all of the fairy tales that I have studied, is actually the film Mulholland Drive, which more or less put me into a fugue state for about an hour. And it was deeply uncomfortable because I didn't know how I was feeling or what my feelings had to do with anything. And you know, we come at these texts with our analytical, deconstructive minds, finely tuned weapons that they are, operating at full speed, and we want something to sink those teeth into, but some texts defy that and essentially say analysis is meaningless. You know, that's kind of the point. And so I love it when that's managed well. I think there's a lot of potential for the fairy tale affect and for texts of the same nature as Annihilation to kind of push you to a place where you feel alienated from the text. But that didn't happen to me in Annihilation. It has happened to me in other texts where I actually walked away very unhappy with the text itself because it was pushing that perhaps in a different key or hard. Annihilation is a beautifully written book that is immersive, that you don't necessarily, it's not so weird that you step outside of it and look at it as unbelievable the entire time that you're reading it. Or at least that was my...
So if I can read a passage that I think supports that reading and your assignment of fairy tale affect to this book, because I agree with what you just said when you put it in those terms. But here's a passage that I think really sums that up fairly well. It's on page 15 in my omnibus. It's fairly early on in the book, in any event. I thought again of the silhouette of the lighthouse, as I had seen it during the late afternoon of our first day at base camp. We assumed that the structure in question was a lighthouse because the map showed a lighthouse at the location, and because everyone immediately recognized what a lighthouse should look like. In fact, the surveyor and anthropologist had both expressed a kind of relief when they had seen the lighthouse. Its appearance on both the map and in reality reassured them, anchored them. Being familiar with its function further reassured them. So it's this idea that even though, for me, we're seeing the known, and by we I mean the characters through the person of the biologist, we're seeing the known, we're not only locating it in real time, real reality with our senses, but we're seeing that it corresponds to someplace on a map, something that other people have known, written down, passed on to us. And yet, we're questioning its entire nature. Not only that it's there, but its entire lighthouseness. And that is so not only constructive of the fairy tale affect as you were describing it, but this weirdness that just pervades all 3 of the books, but especially Annihilation, that I just, I again, this was super early on in the book, but I just fell in love with everything that was going on.
Well, okay, so let's riff on that a little bit, because something that is important to Annihilation and all of its sequels, but specifically Annihilation, is mapping. The actual literal act of attempting to symbolically represent the world that you perceive on another surface, in another plane. And so you have characters walking around with journals, drawing diagrams and handling maps. You have a secondary character in the first book that becomes important later on, who maps the Area X on a brick wall somehow. You have, within this tower structure, which is both a tower and not a tower, you have a creature that is mapping language onto the wall. And so you have described in detail so many different kinds of translation and mapping and description happening, and all of it's unreliable and all of it is hostile to interpretation. How did you receive that impulse within this text? Did you see, I mean, you are, for point of reference, you are in a graduate degree program for geography.
Yes.
How does that fit in with geography, or how does that enrich or complicate the text in a way that's useful for us to understand?
Yeah, so I really like your description of the actions that are taking place here as mapping. I would maybe have said that it was all about, creation of different kinds of signs or signals, or some sorts of written artifacts, visual artifacts that others can look at and hopefully interpret. But, I'm really glad that you called it mapping, because that really moves this into a kind of geographic science fiction in a way that I don't think we see a lot of. And I was sort of joking at the beginning when I said the surveyor character in Annihilation should be a geographer. I say that not because the job that she's doing says to me geography, but rather there are not really any geographers in science fiction or fiction more generally. But, this idea that we can represent a lot of the weirdness that's going on here, the actions that are actively unseating us as readers, not unseating, the actions that are actively unbalancing us as readers, I think that you can definitely call that mapping. And because we can access that action, and the act itself of mapping is so integrally tied up with geography, both in its history and, critically now thinking about what it means to map a place, who can map a place, what maps exist of a place, what a map as an artifact might be, and so many other very heady questions. Calling this a piece of science fiction, a piece of geographic science fiction, is, almost as bizarre and niche as calling it a piece of weird fiction, except then you don't get the connections with, like, Murakami and Mieville and those folks. So, yeah, I really like that.
Which maybe you don't need them.
Yeah,
I don't know if
right.
you need those connections. I don't know that China Mieville is read better for any wider understanding of weird fiction, or that Murakami is better understood or experienced in relation to other weird fiction texts. So I don't know that it's fair to tether VanderMeer's work as well to this notion. I don't know how I feel about it. And the mapping thing kills me so much, because we understand the mapping impulse, because we understand the process of breaking something down and translating it in order to make it more easily understood. But the process of mapping in the Southern Reach trilogy is the opposite. It actually renders things more difficult to understand. Yes. And the unreliability of all of the maps is key to the experience of the book.
Right.
I love it, but there's probably, I hope there's a part of you as an actual geographer who's kind of dying inside every time one of these maps is made unreliable.
Well, a little bit, but I mean, a lot of the work of contemporary geography is very critical. And I mean that in the academic sense, in that, it's trying to gaze at itself, gaze at its history, think about, what power structures exist and have existed and continue to exist, and how do we kind of take them apart? What awkward and ugly histories are we carrying behind us? Again, geography now is less about the making of maps, although it does certainly include that, and more about thinking about the making of maps, and the maps that have been made. So, really what the work that this book is doing, not so much making the maps, but, really underscoring the unreliability of the maps and thinking about, well, is this a lighthouse because the map says it's a lighthouse and we expect to find a lighthouse there, is actually really all about geography, especially like critical human geography as it's done today. So not only would I lump this under social science fiction, but I would call it a work of geographic science fiction.
I think we've figured out one of the few things that you can figure out about this book, which is that it is perfectly in tune with modern geography. So congratulations, VanderMeer. I don't know if you set out to do that, but you did it.
Yay.
And I've actually, honestly, always struggled to understand what modern geography is if it's not the making of maps. So thank you, too, for using a work like this to explain your job to me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would be interested to hear if other geographers who have read this book which is maybe a small number of people. I don't know, but I wonder if other folks would agree. But we can leave that off.
Well, what's the 411 on teaching a class to geographers using science fiction?
I would totally do that. Oh my god, I would make up that class. Someone let me do that. Someone offer me a job where I'm doing that. So I want to return to this promise that I made at the very beginning that we would talk about unknown versus unknowable.
Okay.
So what I mean by that, and I swear I'm going to get it back around to connecting it to this book, but when I say unknowable, I mean never knowable. Because one of the hallmarks of the unknown is that we're gonna try and know what it is. That's kind of all about what Annihilation in particular, but the Southern Reach trilogy more generally is all about. Taking something unknown and trying to figure it out in, unreliable ways, uncertain ways, a lot of different structural ways, a lot of different genre ways, if I'm thinking not just within the book, but also how the books are put together. But unknowable. To me, means absolutely never knowable, either for us as readers or for the characters that are in these books. Sure. Or I should say either or. So I'm wondering, and the question that I want to pose in relation to unknown versus unknowable is, what's going on here first, and then which is ultimately more alien?
Well, spoiler alert, you never find out. That's the point of this trilogy, is even though each character is in his or her own way attempting to decode Area X or what Area X means to them, especially in the case of Acceptance, you have a character with a very personal relationship to Area X, who's essentially attempting to detangle her own identity from that of Area X. It's interesting, but you never figure out what Area X is. It's framed in such a way that the assumption is that you never will, because the point of Area X is to render people unable to assume they know what's going on in their own world. Like, I think that's kind of what Area X is. So there are implications that it's kind of the result of an alien intelligence tied to an ecological disaster, sort of. But that it's a very personal. It's a very personal thing. This Area X. It's attempting to make an area of the world which was forgotten in some ways, which was neglected or just expected to continue going about its daily business the way it always had done, by rendering that somehow inaccessible or dangerous. It forced governments even to recognize that they didn't have control of their world or themselves or perception or reason or any of these things which allow us to relax into sort of quiescence with ourselves. We can't relax in Area X. Even if you're outside of Area X, you can't relax because you never know what Area X is going to do next, what it's going to mean. And I think that in an age where we have a lot of expectations and assumptions about our world, that is honestly one of the most potentially horrifying things about Area X, is that, suddenly we can't assume anything, period.
Yeah.
That's how this book operated on me.
The two words that I used, unknowable versus unknown, asking which is more alien, it kind of feels a little bit redundant when I say that. Like, duh, unknowable is more alien because it's never knowable. But is it? Because I sort of have this sense that, again, going back to that lighthouse moment in Annihilation, you're taking, or the characters are taking what's known, both with their senses and what other folks have recorded on artifacts like maps, and sort of like throwing that known into the unknown. And it's not unknowable because there's something there. There's something both on the map. There's something both that they're sensing. They're wondering about this thing that they're perceiving. They're just not really sure what it is. So it's not fully unknowable. It's just unknown. And that's kind of a little more unsettling than something even as unknowable as what's at the bottom of the tower, for example, which is sort of, it can barely be perceived, can't be described with the words that the book is trying to use, that the character who's describing it is trying to use. And yet, I don't know, I felt this really There's a word I'm trying to think of, and I won't think of it. But there's a really awesome balancing act, I think, between those two concepts of unknowable and unknown that really contributed to how well this book, in fact, the whole series, but again, especially Annihilation, worked on me. That, by simply making what was going on fairly unknown in a standard way, or, completely unknowable, again, in a more standard way, would not have done. That would probably have been still an enjoyable book, because I think Jeff VanderMeer is a really talented writer, and he would have done interesting things with it. But this dalliance with making the known unknown and uncovering the unknowable going on at once just makes for this very satisfying and yet very discomforting experience of the alien.
Well, I would like to point out at this juncture to our listeners that Jeff VanderMeer is not a wizard, and he's not a sorcerer. He's not doing black magic in order to convey what he's conveying. There's nothing about these books that we can't deconstruct and analyze the specifics of. We can look at sentence structure. We can look at how his paragraphs come together. We can look at his vocabulary and his syntax, and we can look at characterization and plot arcs and all of those things. It's not unknowable in a literary sense. You can trace.
No.
You can trace where he's coming from literarily and where where his influences lie, and so it's not that this book as an artifact is beyond comprehension, but there is something about the sum total of the parts which battles simple description, is what I would say.
Yes.
And I would beg our readers as we begin to angle into the conclusion of today's podcast, I would really encourage our readers to give Annihilation one chapter. Just see how you feel at the end of one chapter. I was sucked in. I'm pretty sure, Tony, you were sucked in by the end of the first chapter.
I was.
It's immersive. It's wonderful. Yeah. It's not some sort of alien stepchild that landed on our I don't even know what I'm saying. It's not some gift of the gods that you can't receive as a reader of science fiction or a graduate student or a geographer and analyze meaningfully in those contexts. But it is something which I think is best enjoyed if you just relax into it a little bit.
Yeah.
Relax into the unrelaxable world of Area X.
Agreed.
Okay, so Tony, totally. Final thoughts on Jeff VanderMeer.
Read it. Seriously, just read it. I will also recommend, and I won't do this for just everything, but the audiobook, which was my first experience with Annihilation, was as arresting as reading the prose, because it's very much like, a story that's told by one character as if you're kind of, as though you were her confidant, even though, there's no one there with her. It feels very much like she's speaking to someone, thinking at someone. So that lent itself narratively very nicely to the audiobook format. And so I was very taken with that book and was scared. I mean, I was driving in the middle of the day from California into Arizona, and it was frightening to listen to it, because it's so it really works on you. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very positive way, that it completely immersed me in the worlds and the emotional valences that were going on there.
So maybe this is a work of dark magic. Maybe you were summoned by the text.
Possible.
Maybe this is an actual alien creature that landed on our doorstep and is masquerading as a book. So, dear
very possible
listeners, thank you so much for listening to us ramble on about the mystery that is an enigma wrapped in another mystery, wrapped in another enigma that is the Southern Reach trilogy, and Jeff VanderMeer's perhaps most rewarding series to date. We recommend that you check out these books. We also recommend that you check out VanderMeer's anthology with his wife, Anne, the big book of science fiction that is now available just recently on Amazon. It looks very promising and full of these other authors that we have referenced throughout this podcast. Tony, where can you find us if you're interested in more information about us?
Oh my, you can find us in a few different places now. We are on iTunes and we're on SoundCloud. If you look for the Imaginaries, you will find us in either place. You can also find all of our episodes on YouTube. Again, if you look for the Imaginaries, we'll also, because we're nice people, link you to those YouTube episodes as well as our YouTube channel from our website, which you can find at www.imaginaries.us. And we also have individual links to all of the episodes on YouTube and all of the episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes on our Twitter page. Follow imaginary_pod for more of that.
And if we haven't just confused the heck out of you with all of our different presences online, we do recommend specifically that you check us out on YouTube, because that is our newest platform, and we're very, very proud of transcending into yet another, I don't know, manifestation. Nerdvana. All right, so thank you so much for listening to us today, and you can look forward to future podcasts. We're hoping to spend next week talking about Octavia Butler.
Yeah.
We also, at some point, are going to talk The Expanse Season 2.
We are.
So we are very excited to talk about hard science fiction, as well as, Octavia Butler and everything that she stands for. So check in with us next week for a more wonderful discussion on these subjects.
Yes. And we'll catch you then. Bye.
Bye-bye.